Come along with me. Let's explore the old bell tower of St. George's Anglican Church. Let's read the landscape and the place called Colonial Dorchester. In the southeastern United States is a region known as the Low Country, which extends in South Carolina westward from the Atlantic Ocean to about 50 miles inland. Within the Low Country is Dorchester County, which was named after an early colony located on the northern side of the Ashley River near Bushuie Creek, which is now designated Dorchester Creek. In this county is a city called Summerville, and within Summerville is the Colonial Dorchester State Historic Site. Dorchester County's topography includes elevations that range between 3 to 4 feet above sea level along the Ashley River to approximately 120 feet above sea level in other locations. The approximate elevation of the site of Colonial Dorchester in 2020 is estimated to be between 43 and 50 feet above sea level. All soils were formed or deposited during the Pleistocene epoch, during which the ocean covered the land several times. The climate is temperate, with mild winters and hot, humid summers. We get approximately 50 inches of rainfall annually and have a 223-day growing season, which makes this area ideal for most crops. Native trees in Dorchester County are the loblolly pine, oak, hickory, sweet gum, black gum, yellow poplar, maple, tupelo, ash, and cypress. Colonial Dorchester State Historic Site is located north of the Ashley River along Dorchester Road in Summerville. Opened in 1969, this historic site is listed on the National Registry of Historic Places because it contains evidence of a colonial township. A brick Anglican church was built between 1719 and 1720, not by the Puritans or the Congregationalists who settled the town in 1695, but by Anglicans. The bell tower was added much later in 1751, with a ring of bells being purchased and set up in 1766. Before Europeans came to the Low Country, the Kusso Indians lived on the land now owned and managed by the South Carolina State Park Service, which is the site, of course, of the old bell tower. This Native American tribe occupied the area north of Bushuie Creek, their territory extending westward at least to the Edisto River and the Four Holes Swamp. The Kusso are not to be confused with the Edisto, who are now an extinct tribe. The Kusso lived in long house dwellings constructed of saplings bound together and covered with mud. Men wore deerskin loincloths during the hot summer months, adding leggings and a long cloak and moccasins in the colder winters. Kusso women wore deerskin skirts that came to the knee in summer and the same match coats as the men in winter. Using a mix of wood and tobacco ash, women blackened their teeth. Both sexes wore jewelry created with shells, beads, and metal. Both sexes tattooed their bodies. Additionally, this tribe had a deep spiritual or religious belief, with the sun esteemed as their highest deity. Kusso men fished and hunted deer, bear, and other game with bow and arrow, as well as snare. These Native Americans farmed corn, beans, gourds, squash, and sunflowers. Early English settlers of Dorchester would use dugout cypress boats with sails to navigate the Ashley River, the 15 to 17 miles to and from Charlestown. In 1670, the English settled on the west bank of the Ashley River, moving 10 years later to Oyster Point, which became modern-day Charleston. Puritans were soon established in Charlestown. 25 years later, Colonial Dorchester was founded by a small group of Puritans who arrived from Dorchester, Massachusetts on December 20th, 1695. In 1696, this group obtained a tract of 1,800 acres on a high peninsula just north of Bouchouet Creek. They also gained an additional 2,250 acres between 1699 and 1700 from the Lords Proprietors, a group of 8 wealthy and influential men who owned the land through the English crown. A document written by the Lords Proprietors in 1669 and again in 1698 noted that to be viewed as legitimate, all a religion need do is declare that there is a God and that that God should be worshipped. The Caroline colony then had a vibrant religious diversity, legally declaring, quote, Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion may not be scared and kept at a distance from it. Therefore, any 7 or more persons agreeing in any religion shall constitute a church or profession to which they shall give some name to distinguish it from others. However, in 1706, the Church of England was legally established as the one and only true and orthodox religion, and only these churches could receive public financial support. On December 5th, 1695, the small group of Congregationalists set sail from Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, on the Friendship for Charlestown in the Caroline province. These 8 families, possibly 9 families, were followed by several hundred men, women, and children who arrived in late February of 1697. Together, they planted a church in the wilderness in order to promote the gospel of Jesus Christ and their Puritan belief system. They held their first communion under a large, weathered oak tree near the Ashley River. The small group of Puritan families who arrived in Caroline Province was led by Joseph Lord, recently ordained in Dorchester on October 22nd, 1695, just a few months before they left for Carolina. In 1691, Lord had graduated from Harvard University in Boston, and after teaching for several years, had been selected to recruit a group of Puritans to the province of Caroline, where religious tolerance was high. Several prominent members of the New England Puritans, including William Norman, were already settled in the Low Country, and they invited members of Dorchester in Massachusetts to establish a church in the wilderness out from Charlestown. At that time, there were no churches out of the city. This is an aside, but it's interesting to me that Reverend Joseph Lord, at the age of 32, was an amateur botanist collecting most of his plants in 1704. Overall, he gathered and described even more than 125 specimens of local flora, and he had to ship them back to England to a James Pettiver, who was an apothecary and botanist, because Lord didn't have access to scientific journals, and the trip to and from Charlestown was so arduous and so time-consuming that he was very frustrated. This may have been one of the reasons he left the colony and returned to Massachusetts. But at any rate, he wrote some remarkable descriptions, and one that I think is particularly interesting is when he talks about an Indian telling him of the use of this particular plant in fevers, and that it's also an admirable antidote against the poison of rattlesnakes in particular, conquering the venom of their biting, having been near a month in flower. And then he talks about how it's common in the woods, both in the high and lowland. And then he mentions other plants. And he has a remarkable description of these more than 125 specimens that are still available today to read. So that's a nice aside in a human environmental interaction of a reverend come into the wilderness. Reverend Lord remained the pastor of Dorchester until 1720, when he went back to Massachusetts, leaving his congregation in the hands of Reverend Hugh Fisher. After Fisher, the Reverend John Osgood, who was born in Colonial, Dorchester in 1710 and studied at Harvard and ordained in 1733 back in Dorchester, would pastor the flock and lead the congregation eventually into Georgia in the mid-1750s, which I will discuss later. In 1696, the Puritans built a simple wood frame meeting house for worship services and also meetings, which is one of the reasons they called it a meeting house. In 1700, the Puritans replaced that wood building with a brick structure covered with stucco. This building was known as the White Meeting House and was located about 2 miles south of Dorchester. In these two structures, along with other people living in the surrounding wilderness, the Puritans met for worship services in the years before the Anglican Church, i.e., the Church of England, was declared the true religion, the one and only, in 1706. In 1719, the newly formed St. George's Anglican Parish began construction on the brick church, of which only the bell tower remains today. Completed in 1720, this small structure measured only 30 feet by 50 feet. Reverend Joseph Lord early on expressed his concerns about the financial condition of the colony in a letter written to Judge Samuel Sewall of Boston on May 23, 1706. In the letter he wrote, "They seem not near so encouraging as they did 6 years ago. It is true the country is more frequented by way of trade than formerly, but our rice and tar take up so much room that a cargo of Barbados commodities and the commodities of some other places is worth so much more than a cargo of others that our trade is like to leave the country moneyless." The White Meeting House was a substantial square brick building with a pyramidal roof and windows crowned with flat jack arches with double doors flanking them. In contrast, the Anglicans built their church with an arched barrel ceiling vault, which they associated with the heavens. While Anglicans used arched windows, Puritans rejected this form just as they rejected calling places of worship churches, preferring the term meeting houses. These structural and linguistic differences reflected profoundly disparate theologies. Beginning in 1723, Reverend Francis Varnod led the St. George's Anglican Parish in Colonial, Dorchester. Reverend Varnod complained early on that he had, quote, the misfortune to be in a place that was 20 years ago all settled by dissenters, where they had a considerable meeting house, together with having been constantly supplied with a teacher when St. George's Church could have no minister. Yet notwithstanding all this, we find our church is too small for the congregation of this infant parish. Additionally, this Anglican minister made a concerted effort to convert and aid the Native American populations in the wilderness, blaming the English traders for corrupting the Indians with strong drink, gambling, and other vices. Bricks for the Anglican Church were likely handmade from clay, placed in molds, lined perhaps with copper, and fired in kilns by enslaved people who were owned by the white members of Dorchester Colony. Each kiln may have held up to 500 bricks during a single firing. After the 1886 earthquake, which destroyed the church, bricks were taken from the site. As the township struggled financially, the church was neglected over the years, requiring repairing, repewing, and enlarging by an act of the province in 1734. Note the location of the church structure on this 1742 map. Note that the church is relatively close to the market square. It's also situated at a relatively high elevation compared to the surrounding land. This is based on my observations of the church being set on a knoll at an obviously highest elevation in the surrounding area. And these field visits were in the fall of 2020. Note on the map also the number of unoccupied lots. In 1751, Reverend John Osgood, who was the pastor of the Congregationalists, along with 3 Dorchester residents, was sent into Georgia to scout for a new home near or in Medway, also known as Midway, which is relatively close to Savannah. Approximately half of Dorchester's population decided to pull up roots and move in 1752 after acquiring 32,000 acres in the Georgia colony. By 1761, or perhaps as late as 1771, the rest of Dorchester's members had joined their brothers and sisters in Medway, effectively abandoning their town in South Carolina. Over the years, the Medway Church communicated their affection for the original Dorchester settlement in South Carolina and also to the original settlement in Massachusetts to the Bishop of the Church of England in Boston. So, why did the colonists who had braved so much to build a vibrant church, actually 2 churches, and to establish a trading community on the banks of the Ashley River, decide to leave? There are suggested reasons, and these include over-cultivation of small plots of land given to each family via lottery when they first arrived, resulting in subsistence farming rather than rice farming for trade. Diseases such as malaria, which were very common in terms of outbreaks due to the proximity of river swamps and, of course, incredible numbers of mosquitoes. And this malaria and other diseases cut into the existing population. Natural hazards such as snake and scorpion bites, which were also relatively common. So, what were the other reasons that the colonists abandoned Dorchester? Uneasiness of white settlers toward their slaves who outnumbered them considerably and who were actively engaged in revolts. For example, an African slave uprising in September of 1739 killed 24 white persons. Additionally, several plantations were burned. This was not necessarily in Dorchester, but in the surrounding area. The Stono Rebellion, as it was called, led to the establishment of a law requiring all white men to be armed at all times, even during worship. The growth of nearby Summerville with a new road to Charlestown has been suggested as a reason that profitability of the trade goods of Dorchester decreased. Religious dissent of the Puritans against Anglicanism, which was recognized, as I have said, as the official religion of the province as of 1706, which was within 9 years of the town's founding. However, most of the dissenters had already left Dorchester, continuing to worship in the White Meeting House, while living on nearby plantations rather than in Dorchester itself. This is the earliest known drawing of St. George's Anglican Church. It was drawn in May of 1835. And as you can see, it does appear that the township of Dorchester has been virtually abandoned. Obviously, in the late 19th century, the old bell tower of St. George's Anglican Church was a curiosity. Reportedly, some people dreamed of seeing it and would travel great distances to do so. As can be seen in this photograph, two individuals are looking at the ruins, perhaps on a Sunday afternoon stroll along the Ashley River. In 1886, a major earthquake hit the Low Country on September 1st with a magnitude of 7.3 on the Richter scale. The octagonal base for the belfry and the belfry itself were mostly destroyed, and the bell tower itself split in half. After the earthquake of 1886, the National Society of Colonial Dames provided 3 sets of steel straps to hold the bell tower together for over 50 years of neglect otherwise. The society also occasionally cleared the land of vines, weeds, and underbrush to keep it accessible to the public. The National Society of the Colonial Dames of America is an organization composed of women who are descended from an ancestor who came to reside in an American colony before 1776 and whose services were rendered during the colonial period. The organization has 44 corporate societies and over 15,000 members per Wikipedia. In 1905, a boy who has been described in documents as a Negro and also in other documents as a slave boy, this child frequently herded his sheep into the bell tower during thunderstorms, and he was observed to be sleeping inside the pulpit with his sheep safely in the bell tower. Additionally, members of Summerville continued to use the cemetery associated with the church for some sentimental reasons due to family attachments to the parish of St. George's. So what happened to the ring of bells in the belfry? The largest of the ring of bells was taken by the master of the Dorchester Free School. He hung it in a tree and used to wake the boys each morning. However, his students cut the rope so that the bell struck the ground so hard it cracked and was unusable. The damaged bell was then given to a church in Winnsboro, South Carolina, that had it recast. That church used it until the Civil War, when General Sherman burned the structure in 1865. The bell was thought to have melted in the fire. The other 2 bells were given to St. Paul's Church here in Summerville. In 1885, Summerville's St. Paul's Anglican Church acquired the land that had belonged to the Dorchester Township. St. Paul's claims to have been founded by members of Colonial Dorchester. The church's communion plate and the chalice was passed to St. Paul's. In 1882, the grounds were acquired by the Presbyterian Church. In 1904, Judge Henry Augustus Middleton Smith purchased 600 acres, including the land upon which Colonial Dorchester was founded in 1695. In 1893, the judge, who was also an historian, had erected a fence around the cemetery to protect it. He published two well-researched accounts of the town's history in 1905 and 1919. However, it is recognized that very little is known about the actual history of Dorchester. Apparently, the parish records were lost, and so we have no record of births, deaths, marriages, etc. Upon Judge Smith's death in 1924, the land was acquired by a timber company. To preserve the historic place, the state of South Carolina leased a portion of the land from the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company in 1960 after a Citadel history instructor drew attention to house foundations on the site. Local newspapers picked up the story and drew even more attention to the fact that this was an archaeological find and needed to be preserved. So, the Old Dorchester State Park was formed in 1969, and according to an on-site historic marker, Westvaco eventually donated or perhaps sold the land to the South Carolina State Parks system. Today, the remains of St. George's Anglican Church, along with the Tabby Fort, is the centerpiece of Colonial Dorchester State Historic Site. The brick church formed a traditional cruciform facing toward the east-southeast with an appended chancel 15 feet by 5 feet added later. The bell tower, as I've mentioned before, was built in 1751 and after acquiring necessary funds held a ring of bells by 1766. According to my first field note, what appeared to be a family of 4 briefly entered the bell tower. The apparent father walked down to the historic marker, which describes the church, and read it. Meanwhile, the boy, who looked to be about 7 years of age, along with a girl who appeared to be about 4, ran in and out of the structure, playing. Once outside, the boy yelled quite loudly, "I'm going back in the castle." In the next slide, if you listen closely in the video, you will hear other children playing inside the bell tower as part of what appeared to be a mother's morning out day trip. The children, who appeared to be about 6 to 8 years of age, are laughing and yelling at one another, quite gleefully, unaware they are inside a church. When you play the video, listen closely. You can hear children laughing at one another and saying, "Hey!" Get off, get off. As I mentioned before, they are gleefully unaware of being inside a church. My name is Carley Eason Evans. I am a retired medical speech pathologist, a novelist, and a lifelong learner. Once again, thank you for coming along with me in this exploration of the bell tower of St. George's Anglican Church in Colonial Dorchester in Summerville, South Carolina.